Hi guys and welcome to U-Wrench. Today we're going to be showing you how to change your rear brake rotors and pads on your car. Let's do it. So first things first, if you've not done much work on your own brakes before, you might find it a little bit of a daunting prospect. However, it's not something you should be afraid of. This is quite a simple thing to do, and the brake system on a car is actually fairly simple, especially when it comes to the actual caliper and carrier ends, which is what you're going to be working on, changing your rotors and pads. So don't worry about it, it is quite simple, you can do it yourself. Just follow along with the video and we'll give you lots of tips and tricks along the way, but you can do it, and by doing it yourself, not only will it be rewarding, you're going to save yourself a lot of money down the road as well. So follow along and let's get it done. So stage number one, before we actually jack the car up, what we're going to do is we're going to slacken off the wheel nuts. Literally just half a turn on each of these wheel nuts. And the reason that you do that whilst the weight is still on the wheel is that whilst the weight's still on there, you can actually turn these off. Whereas if you lift the car and then try and undo them when they're really, really tight, what it tries to do is it tries to actually turn the whole wheel. So it's easier when the weight's on the car, just slacken these off and then we'll raise the car and you'll be able to get these off really easy. So next we're going to jack up the corner of the car that you're going to be working on. The best place to find detailed information on the correct jacking points for the car is in the owner's manual that came with your car. They always include very detailed instructions in there, so take a look at that if you struggle and don't know where the jacking points are located. One important thing to remember, and this is especially important if your car has a manual transmission, is as you are jacking up the rear of the car, the front of the car, if it's a neutral, can roll backwards and forwards. So what you want to do is place a chock of some kind, maybe a block of wood, either side of your front wheel, just to make sure that you're jacking it safely and the front of that car can't move backwards and forwards. Especially important if you have a manual transmission. So before we get stuck in, let's take a look at the kind of basic components that we have here and how it works. And the actual rear caliper itself is this section in the middle with these two arms right here. And as we can see, this is a single caliper piston, as is usually the case on the rears. And there's the piston within this rubber boot here. The piston goes directly onto one of the brake pads, which is here. You've got your backing material and your face material. That's your pad number one. Then in the middle of that, that's actually your brake disc. And the second side of that, that's going to be your other brake pad right there. And on the outside of this, we actually have this kind of frame that comes all the way up around the outside. So you've got the caliper in the middle, and you've got this frame around the outside, and that's your carrier, also known as your caliper bracket. That's what actually kind of the pads, the brake pads, as you'll see when we get a little bit further down the line, they actually sit inside this bracket, and the caliper itself and the piston, they actually squeeze those pads and release those pads as you press the brake pedal. Now, the ways that these are connected together is we have, you can see at the top just here, we've got these little bolts here. These are quite short, they're only about so long, and that connects the caliper through into the carrier. We actually have slider pins that move backwards and forwards that allow that squeezing motion. They don't actually squeeze like this, they actually squeeze like this. This side stays stationary. So these slider pins, we'll show you these as we get further into it. So you have one bolt there and a matching one just at the bottom there. And that's what holds the caliper onto the carrier. Now the carrier is connected directly onto the hub of the car, and you've got two bigger, chunkier bolts. Again, one at the top, and there will be another down at the bottom there as well. Moving on to the rear of the caliper, this is for the handbrake here. You can see we've got a little arm on a spring, and you've got a handbrake cable right here, and has like a little eye on it. We're not going to be doing anything with that today, but that's what that is. And finally, coming off of the rear of the caliper, we have this flexi brake line right here, and attached to the brake line we have the ABS sensor as well. So that is the basic setup of everything we're going to be working on today. So let's crack on. So next up, it's a good idea to put a little bit of penetration fluid onto the bolts before you try and remove them. That will just work its way into it and help slacken them off a little bit. It can really help if you end up with some stubborn bolts. It can be the difference between getting them off and rounding them off, so it's well worth doing. If you haven't got a dedicated dismantling lubricant, as they call it, you can use a bit of WD-40. It's not as good as the proper stuff. Loads of brands do a similar type of product, but WD-40, if you've got nothing else, is definitely better than nothing. Now, if you have an ABS sensor which is attached to your flexi hose of your caliper, as we have here, it's a good idea just before we get stuck in just to pop out the two little grommets and just set that safely out of the way. So next up, we're going to remove the upper and lower bolts that connect the caliper through into the carrier. So what we're going to do is grab the correct size socket on the Grand Caravan we're working on today. It's a 1/2 inch, and we're going to get these removed. Now, one thing to bear in mind when you're undoing these is where the bolt passes through into the centre of the pin here. Sometimes, as you can see here, both are trying to turn together. Sometimes, I'm just holding that with my fingers, but sometimes they can be very, very tight together, and you'll be turning this and you won't be able to stop this turning. If that's the case, what you can do obviously is just get the correct size spanner and just slot that down on there, and that will allow you to counter hold that as you remove the bolt from the rear. So there you go, that's what your bolts look like. But as we've still got one more to remove, what I'm going to do is just put that back in, give it a couple of turns by hand, because if you don't, when you go to undo the other one, the whole caliper can start to lift away, so it's just for safety. So next up, I'm going to grab yourself a big flathead screwdriver or a pry bar, and we're just going to pry the caliper away from the carrier. So this should literally just slide off of the brake pads. Very important to note that, of course, by this stage you should not have your handbrake engaged. If you have your handbrake on, this literally won't move at all. So make sure your handbrake's disengaged, and let's get to getting this removed. So very important, what you don't want to do is just leave this to hang, because obviously you've got your nice flexi hose at the back there, and if you start hanging weight off of this caliper you could damage your flexi hose. So what you want to do is you want to find a point where you can safely tie this up. As you see on the Grand Caravan here, we have a little point there, so I think I'm just going to put a cable tie through there and just hold it up there. But again, you could tie it up to the spring there. Anyway, you can tie it up just so you're not putting all the weight on this cable. So next up, we're going to get rid of the old pads. As you can see, they're not particularly healthy on this car. Just give them a bit of a tap, top and bottom. Just enough to get the pry bar in. These discs obviously these rotors have been replaced today, so I'm not too worried about them. But that's all that you do, is you just rock them backwards and forwards and that, as you can see, that's the old pad removed. As you can see, these pads are really well stuck in there, so these really can't have been very healthy at all. Hopefully yours won't get stuck in like these have. But it goes to show you how bad the brakes can get, because these should be free to slide backwards and forwards, and they're jammed solid. Now, on the basis of what I've just seen with the condition of these brakes, I'm predicting the rotor is going to be very, very hard to remove from the hub. I think there's going to be some corrosion in around here, maybe in behind it as well, so it could be an absolute nightmare. So I'm going to put some more of my penetration spray. I'm just going to cover the centre. And give that a few minutes to soak in whilst I move on to the next stage. Hopefully that will work its way down in there and just make cracking that off that much easier when we get to that stage. Fingers crossed. So before we move the carrier, once we do that, in theory the brake rotor is free, and so potentially, I don't think it's going to on this particular car, because we do have quite a lot of corrosion. I think it's going to be difficult to come off, but that could be free from the hub. And so once this is removed, the disc could potentially fall off and land on your feet. So safety first, just put that on. That's going to stop that falling off. So next up, we're going to remove the two bolts that hold the carrier onto the hub. So grab the correct size socket, which for the Grand Caravan we're working on today is 18mm, and start getting these cracked off. And as before, just to enable us to undo the other side safely, just going to put that back in, give that a few turns whilst we undo the other one. So just remove the both bolts, and the carrier can be lifted away from the car, and we can set that to one side. We're coming back to this later. Yeah, so as I predicted, this rotor has unfortunately stuck itself to the hub, so we're going to have to grab a hammer and give this some gentle convincing that it wants to come off. What we're going to do is, when we refit the new rotor in place, we can actually take some measures that are going to stop this happening again. So it's a really, really good tip, as we'll cover when we finally get this off. But hopefully when we come to do this brake job again in the future, because we'll take the step that we're not going to have the problem that I'm facing right here. But I'll show you how to do it if yours is jammed on solid like this one is. So grab yourself a decent lump hammer. And what we're going to be doing is tapping this from the back outwards, and then we'll turn it, hit it again, turn it, hit it again. So rather than hitting it continuously in one spot, you're trying to release it evenly from the hub. Make sure, as we mentioned before, that you have a one wheel nut in place, because when this finally does come off, you don't want it to fly off and land on your toes. So that's what we're going to do. Tap it, rotate it, and keep repeating that process. Carefully remove your wheel nut, and slide off the old rotor. So now the rotor is removed. Before we fit the new one, we want to make sure that we get rid of any bits of corrosion, any little lumps or flakes that might be on here that might stop that new rotor sitting 100% flat on the face of the hub. Obviously you don't want it at a very slight angle, so what we're going to do is grab a wire brush, and we're just going to give this a good wipe around, especially around the inside, just around the inside of the hub circle there, and all across the entire face of it. And as you go, grab some brake cleaner, and we're just going to give this a bit of a clean off as we go. You don't want to be spraying this directly into the centre. It doesn't matter so much on this particular vehicle. But normally you don't want to be spraying the brake cleaner obviously into the bearing in the centre, just onto the face. So give it a really good clean, and attack it again with the wire brush. Just do that 2 or 3 times, depending on the condition, until you're happy with it and it looks good and clean, and then we can get ready for the next stage. So the next stage is an optional one. What we're going to do is this is the little tip I mentioned before that you can do to help prevent the brake rotor getting stuck onto the hub, the problem that we had on this particular car earlier. I like to use copper grease or copper anti-seize, a very common product in car maintenance. When I do this, however, you can also, of course, use the dedicated brake grease product, which we'll be using later in the video as well. I like the slightly old-fashioned way of using the copper anti-seize, but either of these would be just as good for doing this particular job. So I use a brush when I do this. The reason being is you don't really want to get this stuff on your fingers because you're going to be handling the brake pads in a short while. The brake pads faces are slightly absorbent, and so that they can actually soak in grease, and obviously you don't want that. What I'm going to do is give a nice layer just around this section here. This is the section that tends to actually corrode and stick the rotor onto the hub. So be fairly generous around there. And in addition to that, I'm just going to give it a thin layer all the way over between in each of these gaps. If you get any onto the wheel bolts there, we'll just wipe that off afterwards before we continue. This is what we're looking to do. It's a nice thin layer all the way around. As I said, this will help in the future prevent that brake rotor getting stuck onto the hub. So next we'll take a look at the new rotor that's going to be fitted. And what you want to do, if you can, is completely open the box up. So we'll use that. And as you can see, what they do is they kind of vacuum pack the disc. And inside there, they actually coat it with a very thin layer of grease. And what that does, it stops it getting any surface corrosion whilst it's in storage. So you open it up, and it looks lovely, as it does here. It doesn't have any rust on it, but of course we do have a layer of grease, and we need to clean that off because we do not want that to be soaking into our brand new brake pads. So that's the next stage, is get this open and get this cleaned. So to clean your disc, all you do is you grab your brake cleaner again and give it a good wipe. And you want to do this several times. Make sure you get rid of all of the grease that's on there. As you can see, it really does have quite a nasty layer of grease on there. So I'm going to wash off this whole thing using the brake cleaner, and likewise around the side of the centre and also the face of the centre as well. So this whole thing is going to be cleaned using the brake cleaner. So now we just need to flip it over and clean the other side. Now obviously the underside of this had grease on it. That's soaked into this part of the cardboard. So I'm going to use the other part. And again, exactly the same with the brake cleaner, the whole of the face and also the inside. So next up, new rotor. Put it carefully onto the hub. With the wheel nut to hold that securely in place and stop that falling off. Perfect. So if you look at the carriers here, you've got these little metal shims. We're going to be looking at the pads in just a minute, and I'll be showing you the new ones that are going to fit in here. These little metal shims, 2 on either side. So the first thing you want to do is just knock these out. Like so. So just repeat that for all 4. Just gently find a little edge where you can get a bit of leverage on it, and just give it a bit of a tap just to pop it out. So we need to get all 4 of these removed. So next we're going to do a little bit of a clean up just where the shims were, just down in here. Get a little bit of a build up of dirt in behind them there. So you're going to grab your wire brush, and we're going to give these a bit of a clean up. Get them nice and clean in there as well. The other place worth cleaning up is these areas just here as well. This is where it actually attaches onto the hub. You get metal to metal. You tend to get a little bit of corrosion just creeping in between them. So again, we can just give that a bit of a quick wipe over at the same time. Now we've got these looking pretty good. A little bit of brake cleaner, and just give these a final clean up. Careful not to spray brake cleaner onto the rubber boots just here, and repeat on the other side. So next, it's always a good idea to remove and have a look at the condition of your slider pins, and also lubricate them whilst they're out as well. So we'll take a quick look at the basics of it. What you have is a metal pin, as you'll see in a second when we pull it out, and below that you can see we've got this rubber boot, and this rubber boot goes all the way down. As you see, I turn that's the bottom of the rubber boot there. So to release this, all you do is just literally pull it out, and it will pop off like so. And likewise, to remove the boot, just give it a bit of a twist, and try and remember which end went on which end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place that down in that direction, so I know that it went through in that direction. So now we'll inspect the condition of the pin and the fixings, and then we'll lubricate it and get it back together. So let's start by getting rid of some of this old grease. This is actually a very nice looking pin. It's nice and shiny and new. Either this caliper has been replaced in the not too distant past, or they've fitted new slider pins. These are in really, really good condition. Now, the basis of what we have here on the slider pin, that rubber boot, the lip of it sits in this little groove just under the head here. So when you pop this off, you want to make sure that there's no kind of corrosion or gunk or anything that's built up in there. If there is, you can get a flathead screwdriver and just start to get as much of that stuff out as you can. And then once you're happy with it, that it's looking good, give the whole thing a quick blast with the brake cleaner, and so it's nice and clean and ready to refit. And then we'll look at the other elements. So the next thing to look at is, again, the other end of that rubber boot sits into this lip right here. So again, you want to visually inspect that, and if you can see any corrosion or crud or dirt in there, just get off as much as you can, and then give that a wipe over with some brake cleaner. When you do the brake cleaner on this side, don't spray it into the hole, spray it onto your rag, and then use your thumb to work it in around the edge there. And next, grab your torch, shine it in, and kind of look down it and visually inspect it. This one looks like it had a good seal on it, so I'm not expecting to see any contaminants in there. If you can see anything that looks unusual, any particles, any bits of rust, anything at all, that needs to be cleaned out. This one's not. This one's actually looking pretty good, again, because it had a nice seal to begin with. If you do want to give it a clean, and finally, just take a look inside your rubber boot here, and again, you're looking for any contaminants, crumbs, bits of rubbish that shouldn't be in there. If this holds a good seal, which this one looks to have because it was very clean around the edges on both the pin and on the carrier side, then it's highly likely that this has been successful in stopping dirt and water and things like that getting in there. So, but always worth double checking, because that's a good telltale sign. Sometimes they can be full of rubbish if you've had a bad seal. So next up, we're going to apply some grease to the pin before it gets refitted. Now the grease that you can either use your kind of dedicated brake grease product, as we'll be using in just a minute, but I actually prefer, and again this is just personal choice, moly grease, which is a lithium based grease, and this is designed for things such as this, and for things like CV joints where you've got kind of a metal on metal, and also rubber boots and things of that nature. It doesn't degrade the rubber, so this is a really good grease to use. But you know, if you haven't got 2 or 3 greases to hand, as we've been using in this video, you know, you can go ahead and just use your standard dedicated brake grease. So just apply a little bit in towards the end. Just want to get a nice seal as this comes up. Give that a bit of a twist. There. Squeeze out the excess. That should give us a nice seal there. And you want to pull this back as far as you can. Get it in behind the rubber boot if you can. You want to be fairly generous with it, but not too much. Like so, and then we'll just slide that back in. And what you'll find is you have the grease, the excess kind of grease will spill out. That's absolutely fine. We'll wipe that off in just a second. So what we're going to do is just give it a bit of a push and a twist, and see that's popped back on. So I'm just going to wipe away the excess. If you give that a bit of a twist, that'll allow you to wipe the excess off, but also ensure that you get a good seal. So that's kind of the key to the slider pins, really, is making sure that you get a good seal on both of the ends there. So of course what you want to do is repeat exactly the same process on your other pin. So next, moving on to your new pads. When you're buying your pads, you want to make sure that they come with the new set of shims. You can clean up the old ones, and you see these get pretty grimy and horrible over time. But you can, you know, using brake cleaner and your wire brush, you can clean these up if you need to reuse them. They do often break. One of the ones we've just removed is actually broken, but thankfully we bought a set of pads that comes with the new shims. You know, you probably only pay an extra $3 or $4 for a set that comes with the shims, as opposed to ones that don't have the shims. So it's well worth doing. So you can see on this particular set, we've got two different types of shims. Those are the incorrect ones. These are the correct ones. I assume that these pads can be used on other vehicles as well. They use the same pad but a different type of shim. So that's very important to mention. And the only other thing that I'll mention when you come to choosing your pads, these ones are, I believe, ceramic. Yes, these pads are ceramic pads. This has kind of become, I wouldn't say a norm, but it's becoming a much more preferred option. As you see, we've got the ceramic compounds in there, and the main benefit of having ceramic pads is they tend to last a lot longer than semi-metallic pads. They reckon that they can last up to twice as long. That might be a little bit optimistic, but even if they lasted 1.5 times as long, I'm sure you'd be happy with that. So that's, and also they tend to be a lot quieter. You won't get as much brake noise as well. And they're probably only an extra, you know, $5 to $10 to get a set that are ceramic over semi-metallic. So that's worth bearing in mind when you're shopping for your pads as well. So next, we'll take a quick look at the shims. Obviously, these would be the shims for both sides of the car. We need 4 per carrier, so there'll be 8 here, and you should find there's, yeah, there you go, perfect example. Pick the right 2 up first time, it's unusual. There's 2 different types, 2 different sides, so get those sorted into piles of 4 of each. So I'm going to take 2 of each type, pop those back in the box for use on the other side of the car, and these 4 are going to be fitted to the carrier. Okay, the way that these work is this. You see, we've got one little kind of ear that points upwards there. You want that to the outside and also facing up. And you see the little tab on the back there is at a slight angle. So you want to hook that on first, and then just push the front of it on, nice and firm, like so. So that'll be that one there. And then obviously on the other side, again, we have the ear to the outside and facing up. So we'll lock that on there and push that in. Again, nice and tight. And then when you've finished, just have a look from the side profile and make sure that you haven't got any gaps underneath the back of it. And again, looking down in here, making sure that it all looks good and it looks like it's seated correctly. So next up, we're going to lubricate some of the brake components, and this is where your ideal product is a dedicated brake grease. You can ignore the brand. Dozens of different companies make this, and this is available from any automotive parts supply store. So you want to get yourself a dedicated brake grease. What we want to do is just apply a thin layer of grease inside the new brake shims there. And when you do that, you really want to make sure that you get it right up into the corners. You're only looking for a thin layer. This is just to help reduce the friction, to help allow these pads to slide backwards and forwards nice and smoothly. So next, we want to refit our carrier. So just to get these hand tight, and then we'll get the wrench on them, and then we'll get them to the correct factory spec. Another thing to note is when you removed your old bolts, you may have noticed a little bit of blue around the tip of it, which would have been like a nut lock type product. Again, this is a completely optional thing. This didn't have it, and I'm not doing it whilst refitting these. But if you want to, you can just get yourself a bit of nut lock, just put a little dab of it towards the end of the thread, and as you turn the bolt, that will work its way around the bottom of the thread. Don't use too much. So next, you want to grab your torque wrench, because we're going to need to torque the carrier bolts up to the recommended factory specification. Obviously, that's going to vary depending on the make and model of your vehicle. So you're going to have to do a quick quick search on Google, bit of research. Shouldn't take you long to find out what the correct torque setting is for these bolts. So the next job is going to be to retract the piston back into the caliper. Before we do that, we just want to check the condition of the rubber boot, get rid of any dirt or grime that's around it, give that a bit of a wipe off. You don't want to use your brake cleaner on this, obviously, because that can perish the rubber. But I'm just going to give it a bit of a brush down, make sure that there's no splits or tears and it all looks to be in good order. Obviously, if you do have a tear in this, then you're going to have another job to do, because unfortunately you're going to have to replace that seal. But this one's looking good. So rear pistons are generally completely different to front pistons. On the front pistons, you can literally just push that straight back into the body of the caliper. You can't do that generally on rear pistons like this one, because this actually has to be wound in a circular motion, almost screwed back down into the body of the piston. And that's why, instead of having a completely flat face, we've got these little notches top and bottom. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a brake rewind tool, which can be purchased really cheaply on eBay or Amazon. You're talking about $25–30 for a complete set, and it will do any make or model of car and will last forever. So they're a well worthwhile investment. You can buy small little square tools that actually fit onto the end of your wrench, and they can be okay sometimes, but they're not as good as the dedicated tools and I have had problems in the past where I couldn't get the teeth in the little cube tool to match up 100%, and the whole job ended up being a bit of a nightmare. So the cube tools are probably half the price. They're probably $15, but it's really worthwhile investing a little bit of money into getting a proper rewind tool. So this is my brake rewind tool. We're actually producing a video on how to use these brake rewind tools. If you need a little bit more assistance, be sure to check that video out. I'll add a link for you below. First thing you want to do is find the correct plate in your set that fits into your caliper.
And the camera.
So let's grab one pair of the pads. What we have on these pads, see one of them, I've got this little metal arm here on the rear. And the way that this works, this is, they call it a squeal arm or brake wear squeal sensor or whatever. And basically what will happen is this brake pad over time obviously will wear down until it gets to a point where this metal arm will start to rub on the face of your brake rotor, and that will make a like a squeaking, screechy noise. And when you hear that noise, obviously you know that it's time, or possibly a little bit over time, that your pad should be replaced, and should be replaced immediately as soon as you start to hear the squeal. So that's kind of an added safety measure. So when we fit these back on, as you'll see in a little while, you've got to make sure that this one goes on the correct side. Now when you're handling your pads, obviously the sensitive side is obviously the face of the pad. Remember, these are slightly absorbent, so if you rub any grease on these, that can soak into that pad, and obviously that will be very dangerous and massively reduce the efficiency of this, and might even result in the pad not being usable. So you want to be careful not to get any contaminants from your hands onto the faces of these pads. Try and keep them nice and clean. Do not get grease onto these pads. So the other thing you can do is get some of your brake grease, and these little ears, they fit inside those shims. Obviously got the old shim here, as you'll see in a minute when we fit it, and they actually slide backwards and forwards inside the shim. We've greased the shim. I like to add a little bit of grease carefully just to these little ears as well. It's optional. Some people do, some people don't. I prefer, don't do it really thick because you don't want a kind of a build up of dirt in there, but a nice little thin layer of the grease on both of the ears. And the other thing you can do, again, this is at an optional stage. In this day and age, it's not as required as it was in the past, because a lot of these new pads today, they come with these special backing plates, and these are really efficient now at not sticking. But it used to be common practice to apply a little bit of your grease, and a lot of people still do this, including myself, just to the rear faces, the rear, obviously not the face, the rear coating of the pad there. It's just a little thin layer, and basically what that is where your it'll either be, depending on whether it's front or rear, where the piston sits in against the pad, or where the arms of the caliper sit in against the pad. It just helps to stop them binding. And so now we're going to fit our brake pads. Again, be careful not to get this onto your hands or your gloves, because you don't want to transfer it onto the faces. So next, you want to offer your pads up, get the ears in, Give it a bit of a push and a twist. There we go. I'm just going to wipe my hands off, and then we're going to test this. So what you want to do is just test that the pad can slide freely backwards and forwards, which it can, so that's perfect. So just do exactly the same with the pad for the rear, and on the application we're doing, the Grand Caravan, the little squeal arm goes onto the rear of the disc. So just before I slide this back on, I'm just going to clean up the piston a little bit. Be careful when you do this, you don't want to catch the rubber boot. So now just slide your caliper into place. Make sure that your slider pins are pushed in. There we go, perfect. Like so. Next, grab your bolts. Again, if you want to put a little dob of thread lock on the end, nut lock, you can go ahead and do that. Just tighten these up just so they start to go. As you can see, because everything's nice and clean, the little nut here is starting to twist, so I'm going to grab the correct size spanner, and I'm going to counter hold when we torque this up to spec. So now you're going to grab your torque wrench again, and you're going to have to find out what the correct torque is for these bolts for your particular make and model. So a quick Google search should give you that information. Once you have that, set up your torque wrench and get these locked up. So next, remember, we have this ABS cable, so you just want to pop the little grommets back in, top and bottom, like so. Now, before we refit the wheel, there's one more thing that you can do. Again, this is entirely optional, but this is a really good way of ensuring that your wheel doesn't get stuck on the hub. If you've ever had a wheel get stuck on, they can be an absolute nightmare. This particular wheel on this particular car got stuck, and it took us about 10 minutes to knock it off. It was an absolute nightmare. So we're definitely going to use this little tip on this one here. Again, entirely optional, at your own discretion. So what you can do is you can take your copper grease again. Just put a good amount of it around the central ring of the hub there. And then also, it's not required on these are black hat discs, which means that they have a layer of paint on them to help prevent rust. So they probably shouldn't stick as much or corrode as much as normal discs, but making sure, assuming that you have normal discs, just put a very thin layer all the way across the whole face. Keep it nice and thin, you don't want too much. You put a good amount around the centre there, but then just spread it out nice and thin for the rest of the face of the disc. And of course, you're only going up to this edge here, you're not going any further, you're not getting anywhere near the face of the disc. So just to that edge right there. Now it's time to refit your wheels, just line it up. Make sure it sits nice and flat, feels good. Just hand tighten your wheel nuts. Next, just screw them in so they become partially tight. And again, when you do this, don't go around in a circle, you need to go in a star pattern, so you go directly to the opposite side each time. And finally, before we let it down, just give each of these nuts a half-decent crank with your wrench or your breaker bar. Again, not going in a circle, following that star pattern. So next, lower the car back down to the ground so that you have the weight back on the wheel, and grab yourself a torque wrench. Depending on the make and model of your car, the correct torque settings for your wheel nuts will vary. A good place to look for this is in the user manual of your vehicle. If you can't find that in there, then alternatively, a quick Google search. Then grab your torque wrench, set it up to the correct torque setting, and then we'll get these tightened up properly. Again, when you do this, you want to go in the star pattern, not in a circle. So that's it, guys, your brake job is now complete. Now before you jump in your car and shoot down the motorway at 70 miles an hour, what you want to do is hop into your car and test the brake pedal. Make sure that it feels nice and firm, and take any slack out of that brake pedal that's been created by pushing the pistons back in. So when you first press it, it might be a bit spongy because you're pressing those pistons back out, taking up the slack. So once the slack's taken out, that brake pedal should feel nice and solid. Assuming that it does, what you want to do is just roll your car backwards and forwards a few times just outside your house and test those brakes at very low speed. Again, make sure that they're tight and they feel correct. If they do, take your car for a very short drive, not on the highway, at low speed. Again, test those brakes, and then if you're good to go, you can go on and drive them as normal. So that's it, guys. I hope this has been useful for you. If it has, please support us here at U-Wrench by both liking, giving us the thumbs up, the like on this video, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it, and we'll see you in the future on another video.